Welcome, my brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the History of Christianity. I'm so excited to be back with you again. We completed the full first season of the History of Christianity right before Christmas time. We went from the end of the New Testament through the dawn of the Protestant Reformation, and now we're back with season 2, and we will start with the Reformation and move through to the present day. And you ask, well, how present of the day are we going to get? We'll get into the 2000s. So we're going to go pretty close to where we're at today, and we're going to start at the Reformation time. So today, the title of this one is The Call for Reformation, and this is going to be kind of a looking back over all of the things that are going on at this time period that will lead us directly into the Protestant Reformation. So let's jump into this. We start by looking at the call for reformation. As the 15th century came to a close, it was clear that the church was in need of reform. Among the people in the church, it became very obvious that there were problems, there were significant issues, and there was a growing call for reform. And it wasn't just one reason, it was several things. So we'll look at what some of those were today, once again, to remind you of what we talked about at the end of last season. The decline and corruption of the papacy was well known. It was known by that period of time there was a big problem in the papacy. There were problems with the actual popes themselves, but there was also a problem in the fact that there was more than one pope, and that went on for some time. Even after the Great Schism ended, the papacy remained problematic. So even after that, having 3 popes came to an end, there were still problems. The papacy fell into the hands of men more interested in the Renaissance than their spiritual mission. We looked at that last season. These guys that were the popes, they were interested in rebuilding the glories of old. Their minds became very materialistic and very worldly, and their minds were off of spiritual matters. So people noticed that, and they saw it as a big problem. Therefore, while most still believed in the supreme authority of the Roman See, many found it difficult to reconcile their faith with their distrust for the popes themselves. So here's a crisis of faith. I still believe that the pope should be in that position of authority. I still believe in the church, but I'm seeing some significant issues with these guys that are the popes, and that's making me start to question things. And that was happening on a large-scale basis. And boy, was there corruption. Corruption was not limited to the leadership in Rome. We've talked about that quite a bit, but it extended on from that. Councils that had been convened for the purpose of reform were not able to bring about the needed reformation. What became widely thought from those who did have a mind for reform within the leadership of the church was that they could convene universal councils, and that would actually supersede the power and the authority of the Pope, and they could then bring reform by force. But it didn't quite work out the way they thought it would. Even in their success in ending the schism, the conciliar movement proved to have its own flaws when 2 rival councils formed. So it's ironic that this movement that was so dedicated to ending this idea of having 2 popes or 3 popes, and they were actually able to do it. They got it back down to just 1 pope, but then they split, and then you had two councils going on. So even that movement ended up betraying its own objective by dividing itself. Many bishops sitting in the councils were themselves among those who profited from existing corruption. This made it impossible to ever achieve reform. You know, that kind of stuff never comes to an end, really. We see it with our leadership today. You see the very people that are making the laws and would have to be the ones to root out corruption are themselves corrupted. So you're never going to get that group to actually straighten it out. So it makes it impossible to ever achieve reform. It makes it impossible to clean things up. You can't do that when the ones that are tasked with that are themselves corrupt, and that was what was happening here. Such corrupt leadership set the tone for most of the lesser clergy and the monastics. When you have corruption at the top, it's just going to trickle its way down, and it's going to corrupt everybody. Upper echelons of leadership are corrupt, then it's going to go down to the lowest ranks, and you then got an organization that's completely corrupt. And in a lot of ways, that's what happened. Many openly broke the law of clerical celibacy, flaunting their illegitimate children. Now, as Protestants, we don't practice this, and so we don't necessarily agree that it should be practiced, but we definitely don't agree that it's mandated that it should be practiced. But if you are going to say that this is what you're to do, then you need to do it if you agree to it. And that's not what was happening. These people in clerical leadership, they were not being celibate, and they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. People took note of that. Convents and monasteries abandoned their ancient monastic disciplines and became centers of leisurely living. So the very organizations, the monasteries, the convents, the groups that had left the church to move away from what they had seen as being corrupt, even early on in Christianity, when it was just individuals going out to the desert. Now the corruption has spread its tentacles out and it's gotten into those groups too. And instead of them living an ascetic lifestyle, they are living leisurely, and that's gonna draw attention. The groups that, if anybody should be staying pure and staying away from these corrupt practices, it would be these groups. And yet here they are living just as high as you could live. It's not going to escape attention. People saw the corruption and they knew there were significant problems. And then the commitment to learning in monastic houses also declined, and the educational requirements for local clergy were non-existent. Standards just were being thrown out the window. What people had trusted in for so long, the good that these groups were doing. And remember, the education was not just for people that were in the clergy and not just for the members of the monastery. They educated the people. They educated children. They were bringing education to the masses. Well, all of that had gone. All of that was gone. They weren't doing it anymore. Even the people in the monasteries, they weren't educated themselves, so how could they educate others? It was a big problem, and it was affecting things in society, and people were kind of getting fed up with it. Let's look a little bit more closely in the conciliar movement again. The conciliar movement had faded. So remember, this is the group that said we can root out corruption by having these councils, and the councils will meet periodically and they will bring reform. Well, that movement was coming to an end, and one of the big reasons it was coming to an end was because it wasn't accomplishing anything. They really never accomplished much of anything. There was less and less hope that a general council of the church could produce reformation. And they didn't. They didn't, at least not near enough. There were some minor things, but not the big, widespread reform that they were hoping for. Evidence of this came when the Fifth Lateran Council was convoked by Pope Julius II. Though it was billed as a council to reform the church, it was actually an effort to regain political control for the popes. So the popes figured out that, yes, these councils might have been commanded to take place in order to root out corruption, but I'm the one who calls them. I've got a lot of power on over who's there, and I can actually use it to my benefit. So the popes found a way to make their corruption go even further and their power to go further by using the councils themselves. Convened in 1512 and continuing into 1517, the council accomplished no reform. Wasn't going to accomplish reform because that's not why the Pope called it, even though it was supposed to be. The greatest achievement of the council was an extraordinary taxation for the next 3 years. This group, trying to bring reform to the church, what did? They start taxing people and sucking the money out of the general public. A lot of people that are poor don't have it. They're taking more and more away from them. Is it going to be used for any good? No, it's not. It's going to be wasted. And so the Pope is gaining more power by virtue of the fact that he was able to accomplish this. This taxation served to reaffirm the authority of the Pope against French efforts for reform. So the Pope has figured it out. He knows how to game the system, and he is living as high as he can get and getting even more money than ever. Interestingly, the council adjourned in March of 1517, which was just a few months before the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. So even though the leadership may have thought, hey, we're getting away with this, even though there was as much corruption as ever, even though people were grumbling and not really able to do anything about it other than be upset, there's changes coming. It's going to come in a way that the leadership doesn't see it coming until it's too late. And we're going to be jumping into that all throughout the first several weeks of this study. So let's look at some of the problems in the teachings of the church. Not only were there problems with the church at the moral level, but there were some who became convinced that the teachings of the church had also gone astray. And that's really going to be one of the big factors that brings the Protestant Reformation into existence. It's probably the thing most people think of as being the reason for it, but it's not the only reason. We're going to see that when we jump in to looking at that, but it definitely was a big factor. The fall of Constantinople had flooded Western Europe with scholars whose views were different from those common in the West. So you've got a group of people coming in who they weren't under this authority of the Pope and the church in the West, and they thought about things differently. The copies of manuscripts these scholars brought with them alerted Western scholars to the many changes and interpolations that had resulted from the copying of ancient texts. So they have some texts that are not corrupted in the way that the texts that existed in the West were. Some of those corruptions were just things that were going to happen over time. It was inevitable that there would be some manuscript issues with texts that are copied multiple times over a long period of time. But some of it also was not, leadership was not being honest about. Some of it had even been changed intentionally. So they start getting a look at some of these texts that are coming in, and they're saying, whoa, wait a minute. Some of the stuff we've been told is not in here. I'm not seeing it, or it's different than what we have. There's a problem. And so they start to recognize that. And then Greek became more commonly known among Western scholars. Remember, there's a desire to go back and learn the ancient ways. They start to go look at the languages of the documents written in the classical Greek time period. And they're going to already have a knowledge of Latin, but they're going to add to that a knowledge of Greek. And that allowed them to then compare those Latin texts, the Latin Vulgate that they had, with the Greek texts that they found from this group, which were closer to the original than the Latin. And they begin to see again that there's some issues. There was a growing desire to return to the sources of the Christian faith, particularly through the study of Scripture, which would result in reformation of existing doctrine and practices. So there is a desire now that their eyes have been opened. We need to get back to the source. We need to get back to the Scripture, and we need as pure a version of that as we can get. And we need to be willing to compare what we find to what the church is teaching. And if there are some issues with that, it needs to be confronted. And boy, is that going to be coming very, very soon. This movement was really a movement of the common people. Now, obviously, there had to be people in higher leadership roles or higher academic circles to get this going, but it was a movement among the common people. There people of the day that were not in these leadership roles, that were on the outside looking in, they fueled this. And so we need to look at what life was like for them at this time. Among the masses of common people, there was much discontent. Life might have been really high and going great for the people in leadership in the church, but it wasn't going so great for the common people. Economic conditions among the masses had worsened over the last few decades. So there's definitely more poverty. There's definitely more, it's getting more of a struggle to survive. Hard times are here. While you're watching the people that are supposed to be taking care of you living high on the hog, you're not doing so well. Though some monastic houses and church leaders continue to practice acts of charity, and we need to say that. It's easy to just have a sweeping generalization that everybody was bad, everything was bad. That's not the case. And it never is. There were those that were still doing the right thing. There were church leaders that had the right heart. There were the monastic houses that continued to take care of people. That happened. It's just that it wasn't the majority anymore. And what had become the common practice was to not do those things. So even though there were still some that were, and they should be given credit for that, it still just became too widespread. Most of the poor no longer viewed the church as a defender, but instead an antagonist. So they're looking around and thinking, all right, wait a minute. The church is not making my life easier. And in fact, it's not even just not having an effect. It's not even just neutral. It's actually causing me problems. It's actually making my life harder. That's going to bring some discontent to the people. You can only push people so far before there's going to be a reaction. And the reaction is on its way. The ancient feudal system was coming to an end. Powerful monarchies in France, England, and Spain forced the nobility to serve the ends of the nation as a whole. So there's much more of a nationalistic idea going on here, and that's taking away from the universality of Western Europe, and it's taking away from the universality of the church. People are beginning to look and see themselves as nations, not just one common group of people. And so that's going to create some dividing lines, and it's going to create some issues. Even in areas without the same unity, such as the Netherlands and Germany, nationalism took hold. That's a big thing going on at this time. Latin, which had been the common language of Western Europe, was replaced by the developing vernacular languages of each nation or geographic area. Another factor that comes into play is the Inquisition. The growing power of monarchs, the diverse opinions and ideas in a time of intellectual unrest and frustration with the actual life of the church created pushback from the church. While the people are pushing back, the church then stands up and pushes back itself. It's not going to just take that. This took the form of an increase in the powers and activities of the Inquisition. During the Middle Ages, it was not uncommon for bishops to act as inquisitors, investigating the theological opinions of their people and severely punishing any teachers or leaders espousing heretical views. The church is not going to just be introspective and look at itself and say, well, if there's so many people thinking there's a problem, maybe we need to just take a good hard look at ourselves. No, their solution was, let's attack the people that are coming after us, and we'll squash this down. Now, anybody in is a student of history knows that this is the exact opposite of the way you should handle this. If you want to really stoke a little bit of a spark or a small fire into a blazing inferno, then go ahead and take people that are fed up anyway and attack them further and see what happens. It does not go well at all. And we all know that that is going to lead to a big, big split. But in the 15th century, particularly in Spain, the powers and activity of the Inquisition rose to new heights. We know about the Spanish Inquisition in history. Even if you don't know exactly what that is, you at least remember that name and remember studying something about it. The Inquisition was not only in Spain, but it became particularly severe in Spain, and that's what we remember is the Spanish version of this. The Inquisition was placed by the Pope under the authority of Ferdinand and Isabella. You probably know those names. Ferdinand and Isabella, they were given authority by the Pope to be the ones in charge of the Inquisition, and they branded heretics during this period, and those people were persecuted with great zeal. So they took that authority and ran with it. The biggest target of this persecution were Jews who had been converted by force and were now accused of Judaizing. Isn't that funny? So you've taken a group of people who are Jewish, you've made them become Christians by force, and then you attack them because they like their old religion better, the one that they never wanted to leave in the first place. That seems fair. In 1492, it was decreed that all Jews must either accept baptism or leave all territories under Isabella and Ferdinand. So in other words, you can stay or you can go, but if you're going to stay, you're going to become baptized and become a Christian. Or you can abandon everything you've ever had, the only place you've ever known, you can just leave. And that was the choice that they were given. It is estimated that during this time, approximately 200,000 Spaniards who were practicing Jews were exiled, losing most of their possessions and often their lives. That's a lot of people, 200,000 people in Spain. And understand, these were not just people who had just come there lately. These were people that had been there for generations in their family. And all of a sudden, they've got to go. They were displaced, and many of them were also killed. And for no other reason than because they chose to not practice Christianity. This treatment was also extended to the Moors. We've talked about them last season, the Muslims, although they were forced into baptism and not allowed the option of exile. They didn't even get the option to leave. They were told you're staying and you're becoming Christian. They didn't necessarily like that, so much bloodshed came as a result. Eventually, the powers of the Inquisition would be employed to help prevent the spread of Protestantism. So this is the thing that we need to remember. This idea of attacking people for beliefs that go outside of what the church condones, or even just questioning anything that the church authorities don't want you to question, there's already a mechanism in place to deal with that. And this acquisition power is going to turn away now from the Jewish people, the Muslim people, and it's going to be employed against those who are questioning the church and will ultimately split away in the Protestant Reformation. It becomes important to look at this next group because they kind of help pave the path to Reformation as well, and that is the humanists. An old world was passing away and a new one was being born. The Middle Ages were coming out of that. There's new enlightenment and things are changing. Some sought to reform the old church from within, while others openly broke with the papacy. There were those who were starting to break away. That's going to happen more, but there's still a group that wants to try to change things from within. There's still a group that wants to stay together, stay united, but let's fix what's wrong. They hadn't given up on that yet. The resulting disagreements and conflict marked the entire age known as the Reformation of the 16th century. And of course, that's what we're leading into. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, there were some who hoped that the furtherance of scholarship and education would produce reformation within the church. Their thinking was some of this knowledge that was lost, some of this knowledge that we didn't even have, or maybe we had it, but we didn't have documentation for it, or we see that there are significant problems in some of the texts that are being used. Naturally, that'll lead to reformation because people will see, wait a minute, let's fix this. There seems to be some problems here. Well, let's go back and look at this honestly, and we can fix it. You got to want to do that, and you got to actually not resist it as strongly as you can. And this is a very hopeful thought, but it didn't work. It was thought that the return to the sources of Christianity would do away with practices contrary to original Christian teaching. Nope. This was the program of the humanist reformers. The term humanist in this context refers to those who devoted themselves to the humanities, seeking to restore the literary glories of old. Maybe a different way of looking at this word than what we would think of today. The humanists of these days, they're people who were devoted to the humanities. So they wanted to bring back the art of old, the literature of old, the glories of old, those things that had passed away but now were being rediscovered. And they were dedicated to bringing those back. And a big thing that's going to be in play with that is Christian teaching, because so much of what had been written and so much of what was in the humanities area did have to do with Christianity. Long before the Protestant Reformation broke out, there was a large network of humanists who carried on correspondence among themselves and who hoped their work would lead to the reformation of the church. There was already this thinking, even before the Protestant Reformation broke out, that there can be reformation in the church by looking at some of the problems of the teaching of the church. And there was a group already there. They were already, not that they were wanting to break away, but they were ready to challenge what the church was doing and try to help be part of the solution and not the problem. They were already in place. Their acknowledged leader was Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus was born in Holland, the illegitimate son of a priest and a physician's daughter. His opinions came to reflect the common values of the bourgeois: tolerance, moderation, stability, etc. So this is the merchant class. He began his studies with scholastic theology. If you forget about that, you can go back and listen to, I think there's a whole episode on the scholastics. So just terrible, terrible theology that was going on in the Middle Ages. But he turned away from that. He wanted to get into classical literature because he saw there was tremendous problems with scholastic theology. Later, during a visit to England, Erasmus became part of a group of humanists interested in the Reformation of the church. This group introduced him to the study of Scripture and early Christian literature. So what was the philosophy of Erasmus? Erasmus came to describe Christianity as a decent, moderate, and balanced life. He looked at Christianity as kind of being, stay away from the extremes, live a balanced life. He saw the commandments of Jesus as similar to the precepts of Stoicism and Platonism. Their purpose is to subject passion to the rule of reason. Isn't it funny that these guys, over 1,000 years later, are coming back to the same guys that the early Christians liked in Greek philosophy, Plato. They loved Plato then. They liked the Stoics then. We're back to it now. This what was old is new again. They've come back around full circle, and Plato's back in play. This was to be achieved through an ascetic discipline, though not monasticism, which withdraws from daily life. Erasmus believed Christians should live a practical and daily life in the midst of human affairs. So Erasmus, his thinking was, yes, you need to live like the monastics do, but you can't pull away from society. You need to do what they were doing within the culture, within society. Christianity is to be practically lived out in the midst of other human beings, not pulled away out to a desert somewhere or in your own community to only be in an echo chamber around people that agree with you. Do it in the midst of people. And that was the way that he believed every Christian should live. He believed reform would come once Christians began living this discipline and abandoned the vices of the pagan world. He rejected the pomp and the quest for earthly glories that characterized much of the life of the church at this time, calling for a lifestyle of greater simplicity. So this is just a part of that growing dissent among the people of the day against the luxurious living of the upper echelons of church leadership. And he definitely was on board with putting a stop to that. Erasmus believed the call to obedience was not just for the monastics, but for all Christians. For him, obedience was more important than doctrine. So he was calling everyone to live this kind of lifestyle. Every single Christian live the way the Word of God teaches us to live. And if you do that, you will make a change, and it'll be a change for the better, and it'll bring reform into the church. That was his hope. Erasmus held to Christian orthodoxy, but held that righteousness was more important than orthodoxy. So his opinion was it's more important to live right than it is to believe right. Now, truthfully, you have to have both. That's what the Bible teaches. But I do think that he's catching on to the time. And I think throughout this Reformation period, we're going to see, and it's natural that this is the case, certain aspects of the Christian life are being emphasized as a reaction against the aspects of the Christian life which are not being lived out the way that they should. So should you have correct doctrine? Yes. But is it okay to have orthodox teaching in the church if the leadership of the church doesn't live in a righteous life? No, it doesn't. It won't work doing it that way. And he sees the problem. So he's putting an emphasis on this because he sees that everything has gone off the rails the other direction. And you can understand that. He was heavily influenced by Platonism and was convinced that the Christian life was one of inwardness. Again, we're back to Plato. He just keeps popping back up. His focus was on the inner life over outward expressions of faith. Erasmus sought the reformation of customs, the practice of decency and moderation, an inner devotion shaped by learning and meditation, and a church that encouraged those things. And he was living in a time of a church that didn't encourage those things. They encouraged the opposite of those things. And again, this is a direct reaction to the problems of the corruption that these humanists saw in the church at that time. He gained the admiration of scholars throughout Europe who shared similar hopes. Among them were members of the nobility and even some kings. The Reformation he advocated seemed on the verge of breaking out. He's starting to get people in high positions of leadership that are saying, yes, that we agree, there are problems. Yes, we need to make some changes. Yes, let's get back to what is more important. It's starting to light a fire. Then the Protestant Reformation broke out. So right as there was becoming a pull or a push within the church, within people that didn't want to leave the Catholic Church to reform from within, right as that's starting to catch on, the Protestant Reformation comes. The focus then became much more radical, shifting some of the fundamental premises of traditional Christianity. The humanists were not necessarily wanting to go as far as the Protestants went, the Protestant Reformation went. They were not making huge pushback against the teachings of the church. It was more about the practices of the people in leadership. The Protestant Reformation had a problem with both. And now we got a more radical movement that's going to come into play. Both Protestants and Catholics sought his support, but Erasmus preferred to stay out of a conflict in which, to his view, passion seemed to replace reason. Erasmus was not for the division. He was not for the breaking away. He thought that things could be accomplished from within. And both sides tried to get him, the Protestants obviously, because they saw him as someone who agreed with them there were problems in the church, but then the Catholics because they saw in him someone who wanted to keep the church together. So both sides wanted to reach out to him, but he ultimately wouldn't go with either one. He just really wanted to stay out of it. He eventually broke with Luther and his followers, but still refused to support the Catholics in their attacks against the Protestants. He had sided with Luther and definitely saw the things that Luther pointed out as being correct, but eventually he couldn't go as far as Luther went. He just wasn't willing to do that. So he broke from that group, the first major leader of the Protestant Reformation, but he didn't go out against them either. He never did support the Catholics in full-on attack. So he stayed, again, very neutral ground. During a time of great conflict, he called for tolerance and moderation, but few paid heed to him during his lifetime. But eventually, centuries later, both Protestants and Catholics came to admire the mind and heart of Erasmus. So a guy that had an impact in his day, possibly could have had more of an impact if things had broke just a little bit differently. But they broke in a way that he wasn't willing to go completely all the way, and he wasn't willing to ignore the problems that he saw. He was a guy who tried to maintain what he felt like was remember, he wants the balanced life. He wants to stay away from the extremes. So he's not going to go with an extreme side either way, regardless of whether they thought he was on their side or not. It did limit the impact that he had in his day, but it doesn't limit the impact that he's had since then in history. He was a guy who helped to bring about the idea that there were problems that needed to be corrected. He didn't go in a direction of going completely away from the universal church, but he also didn't go in a direction of saying everything's fine, let's just move on. And so he's an important figure at this time, not the most important, but definitely a guy leading up to this Reformation time who had a great impact. So that's it for today. That kind of gets us up to immediately jumping in next week to looking at Martin Luther. There's not a more important person when it comes to the Protestant Reformation than him. He gets the ball rolling. Now, obviously, he's not the only guy. We'll be looking at a lot of guys. And we'll see that in the scope of time, they were having the same things going on in their lives that Luther was. So it wasn't just because he jumped out that they did too, but he's the one that's going to bring this from a little simmering flame to a full-blown forest fire that's going to burn some stuff down. So we'll jump into that. It's going to be really good. I hope that you can be back next week. I do want to remind you one more time, because I just want to give credit. The information that I'm using for this book is The Story of Christianity. Now we're on volume 2. And it's an excellent book. I use it as my primary source. I do look at some other things, but it is definitely the primary source. You can go through these sessions and go to that book, and you can find directly where I'm pulling from, even in some of the titles on the slides. So big source here, and a very excellent book. If you ever get curious and want to read a great book about the history of the church, you can do that. You're hearing a lot of it on this. But just want to give that credit again. Thank you for taking time with me today, and I hope that you can be back next week as we begin to look at Martin Luther. God bless.